Think of what it takes to make a car. You need steel and aluminum, glass, rubber, plastic, silicon, fabric or leather. You need mines, rubber plantations. You need a way to refine petroleum to plastic. You might even need wood. Then you need a way to form these raw materials into the parts that go into vehicles, like rubber and petroleum into tires, wiper blades, belts, and engine mounts, aluminum and steel into chassis, body panels, nuts, bolts, and other components. I can go on and on. The tariffs the Trump administration has instituted on the automotive industry will affect all of this. The ever-changing situation and the maze of different rules and exceptions make it tough to know exactly how all this will affect car prices, but some estimates have said a lower-priced car, meaning those that cost below $40,000, will increase by about $6,000. The issue is that a significant share of cars sold in the US are made somewhere else. So how realistic is a 100% American-made car, from raw materials all the way to final assembly?
It would be implausible, if not impossible. There is no car even close to being 100% US made in the US.
We can move everything US, but if every Ford is $50,000, we're not going to win as a company.
Arguably, the first big hurdle to building up a domestic automotive supply chain is understanding it. The fact is, the current supply chain is extremely complex, global, and not very transparent. Cars are made in factories owned by automakers, often called OEMs, or original equipment manufacturers. That's Ford, GM, Tesla, Toyota, BMW, Mercedes, etc. There are 55 auto assembly plants in the US, spread out across 15 states and owned by 20 manufacturers. Some American, many foreign. But many cars sold in the US are made in other countries. The White House said that half of the 16 million light vehicles sold in 2024 were imports, but industry numbers paint a different picture. Research firm Jado Dynamics says the share is more like 61-39. But the tariffs also apply to the roughly 20,000 parts inside a car. Some automakers make some parts in-house, but they still rely on a vast network of suppliers organized into 3 tiers. Tier 1s provide the most complex systems, say an EV battery, a transmission, or an infotainment system. Tier 2 suppliers provide the simpler parts that make up these systems. Tier 3s provide raw materials and extremely simple parts, like screws or bolts. The global auto industry sources parts and materials from somewhere between 50 and 120 countries. On average, this is where the parts in US-made cars come from. There are a few reasons for this. Companies are legally required to disclose some sourcing information, but laws allow them to hide a lot of it. Secondly, a single part might have materials and components from many countries and may make several trips back and forth across a border. Third, automakers and suppliers are loath to share information about supply chains they consider trade secrets.
Manufacturers are fairly secretive with their information. They don't want their competitors to know what they're doing and to share a lot of data that they have a competitive advantage. So it's hard to get that information. And that's where one of the challenges is going to be compliance. Are there going to be inspectors running around there, going into the auto plants?
The Model 3 Performance is assembled in Fremont, California. But here's what the most recent government chart shows for the parts included in that car. 70% of them come from either the US or Canada. The law doesn't require that automakers break out the parts that come from just the US. That means all 70% could come from Canada. Also, a part gets counted as a US-Canada part if 70% of its value comes from one of those countries. In other words, a $10 part could be $7 of Canadian value and $3 of Chinese value, and it would still just get counted as American or Canadian.
If we want more visibility on this, we're going to need more legislation to break out what exactly is US made on a car and what isn't.
An automatic transmission might have gears made in Canada, vacuum solenoids made in Germany, but the transmission itself might be made in South Carolina by a Mexican or a German company. A single part can cross the US-Canada border several times before it's put into a car. What is clear is that the total supply chain has spread throughout the world. This is partly because labor is cheaper in a lot of places outside the US, because of where raw materials are located, and because some regions of the world have almost totally monopolized some industries.
Foreign manufacturers are becoming more American. American manufacturers are becoming more foreign. Kind of a shift there from being totally American-made on the part of an American manufacturer, say General Motors or Ford, to more and more outsourcing parts, components, and subassemblies from Canada and Mexico and other parts of the world.
If you go back to the mid-2000s, we had vehicles, the top 10 vehicles were 90% US and Canadian parts. That's kind of gone down since the vehicles have become far more complex. We've had a globalization of the auto industry that has occurred over decades.
The left-leaning Economic Policy Institute found that imports of parts from Mexico rose from $29 billion in 2007 to more than $78 billion in 2023, far outpacing the growth of parts exports.
And this is where it's going to be very, very complicated for these producers to figure out, how do we change our sourcing strategy? Are we going to get our parts manufacturers to move here to the US to produce parts in the United States for vehicles that are assembled here?
Sources have told CNBC that getting a car with currently 70% US Canadian parts up to 90% can cost an additional $10,000 to $20,000 for companies per vehicle. The price of a full-size pickup, already almost $64,000 on average, could rise by an additional $7,000 if we try to get as many US or Canadian parts as is currently possible.
The more you push into the tier ones and the tier Ns, and the more you push then above that sort of 75% mark, you start hitting some very uneconomic things and some things that would take time, a lot of robots, and other things that are not necessarily that useful for the stated goals.
When you talk about a vehicle being 100% made in the US, if you drill down to the raw materials, I mean, you're talking decades to set up a establishment of the mines. You're talking tens of billions of dollars in investment.
This would include mining and processing for critical minerals, such as cobalt for EV batteries and palladium, platinum, and rhodium for exhaust systems on gas cars. Some of these minerals are increasingly important. EVs require 6 times the amount of minerals as a gas car. There are some sources of some of these in the US, but imports make up a significant share. On average, it takes more than 16 years to bring a mine from the exploration phase to production, though it varies by mineral, type of mine, and location. The US has one of the longest development timelines in the world, second only to Zambia. Rare earths form the basis of magnets that are used in all kinds of devices, including cars, especially EVs and hybrids. China is by far the largest producer. It controls nearly 70% of mine production and about 90% of the world's processing capacity. Between the 1960s and the 80s, the US was the largest rare earths processor, but China has made massive investments in recent decades. The Asian country has periodically restricted exports of rare earths, prompting governments and companies to seek other sources. Fears over shortages have spurred calls to bring production back to the US, which currently has just under 10% of the world market. But some parts are not easy to reshore either. Take chips, for example. In 2022, forecasters were expecting auto industry demand for older, simpler chips, which are still commonly used in cars and other electronics, to rise 23% by 2026. Demand for more advanced chips is also likely to rise.
We're increasingly needing more crazy stuff for the automated driving, both the assisted automated driving as well as trying to get closer and closer to autonomous. That stuff takes serious compute power. Because you're going for more expensive chips, that makes it more difficult to avoid China. You've got an industry that never really anticipated not having Taiwan available to it to supply chips.
Cars' dependence on foreign semiconductor manufacturers, overwhelmingly based in Asia, became apparent during the pandemic-era chip shortage. Prices of both new and used vehicles skyrocketed in the US as a consequence, leading to lower production and vehicle inventories.
Thanks in part to the CHIPS and Science Act, US semiconductor companies are expected to triple their manufacturing capacity over the next several years. They've already invested about $500 billion since 2020, and they are forecast to capture about a third of global capacity by 2032.
These newer plants will likely be building newer, more advanced chips, rather than the older analog chips the auto industry more heavily relies on. Then there are parts like wiring harnesses, which hit a shortage when war between Ukraine and Russia broke out. Putting them together is labor-intensive and not easy to automate. Other things, like the cut and sew work used to make fabrics for interiors, tend to be lower-wage jobs.
The labor in the US just isn't terribly available. If you then pivot, which is more likely to happen, instead of a lot of jobs coming, it's more like a lot of capital and a lot of automation would come. There's not like a flotilla of people available next year to do that robot programming for all the robots that would be required to make it remotely cost competitive to do more than 90-ish% of the vehicle locally.
These are just a few examples. It doesn't include the massive global supply chains for raw materials such as steel, aluminum, rubber, plastics, and countless other things that range from the simple to complex.
It would take a decade more to set up everything, and we're talking Ferrari level vehicles. We're talking very low production, very expensive vehicles. When you look at something like Ferrari, Italian pinnacle, they are the champion for the Italian auto industry. But I mean, even their vehicles are not 100% made in Italy.
Getting above that 90% mark, right now you just couldn't do it for the whole industry. There's no price you could pay because the parts don't exist to buy to make 16 million vehicles worth of stuff. Everyone knows that.
There are some things that are easier to reshore, such as assembly plants, especially ones that focus on higher volume vehicles. Tier 1 suppliers tend to cluster around auto factories. Automakers prefer to use just-in-time manufacturing techniques, meaning they source parts as they are needed to cut down on inventory and save factory space. A supplier manufactures a seat, and just a few hours later, it's put into a car.
By nature of putting the assembly plant and focusing on an assembly plant, you basically make a gravitational pull for a lot of our content that makes a lot of sense and doesn't hurt you economically because it doesn't force you to get the cobalt from some new source. It doesn't force you to get the forging not from India. It doesn't force you to get the fastener not from Taiwan. And it doesn't force you to get the battery cell not from China.
To start, you can do what the US government has done by incentivizing or subsidizing the creation of homegrown industries in chips or rare earths. That, says Wakefield, was really the purpose of the Inflation Reduction Act, to identify a handful of industries the US needs to build up domestic capacity in for either national or economic security.
You saw the impact of that with IRA when it went in. The Europeans freaked out because they said, oh my God, now everyone's rushing to make a battery plant in the United States.
But auto industry insiders are extremely skeptical the automotive supply chain can become considerably more American than it is.
Many of the supplier executives and people I talked to on background said, no, it's not possible. We're not set up like that anymore. The raw materials aren't there, and it would just put us out of business. The things that are most feasible to do in the US right now are mainly what is being done. So even if you did move everything to the US, you wouldn't be able to essentially have the same production as you do now, which could then lead to lower production, less jobs, and eventually, a company going out of business.